Okay, so we're going to take a look at our first reason, which is the United States was under attack despite its neutrality by Germany's pursuit of submarine warfare. What I want to do is look at the first phase of submarine warfare. And the first phase is really the actions that set the scene. So what we have here is we have the apply the Declaration of London in 1914. Now, what this basically is there was this treaty that was made up, and many of you guys have probably read that, where they created this, here's how we behave in wartime, and here's what neutrals can do. They can trade with anybody, you can't blockade, you can't keep them from going in, except you can check to see if they have some contraband goods. If they have like guns or munitions, then they can't come in. Otherwise, they need to be allowed in. And so what the United States wanted to do was go to England, go to Germany, go to everybody and say, hey, why don't we go ahead and follow the Declaration of London? They had to give that up in about a year, less than a year, because nobody was listening. It was something that wasn't a very popular idea, and not something that people were able to really grab onto. And so basically Great Britain wanted nothing to do with it. Then shortly after that, Great Britain declares the North Sea a military area. They did this on November 3rd, 1914. And what that basically means, if you look at the little map that is up on the slide, you'll see that the North Sea is a area where Germany has its ports. And so what they did was they basically blocked this off. They put a minefield there. And so that minefield then is keeping them from being able to move forward. And so the North Sea area then is keeping them from being able to do it. Now, if you look at the other map, this is Germany's response. Germany's response was to say, well, if they are going to blockade our ports, then we are going to declare the waters around England a military war zone, and we are going to sink anything that goes into those waters with submarines. Well, what's interesting is they both basically say you can't trade with these other nations. But what's interesting is Wilson's response. Wilson only responds to Germany with the document called Strict Accountability, basically saying that we will hold you strictly accountable for anything you do towards American citizens. And this really shows both Wilson's bias towards Great Britain, but also the fact that he doesn't understand the new technology and how the new technology is a game changer. And Wilson is still sticking to the traditional way of looking at naval warfare. And so basically it's a situation where Wilson's misunderstanding it. But either way, we'll talk a little bit more about the influence of strict accountability on Wilson later. All right, so now we have the second phase of submarine warfare. So the Germans in early May, late April, early May, took out ads in the New York Times, and they basically said, here's the situation. The Lusitania is, and any other ship that goes into the war zone is going into a war zone. And they took out basically news because they had intelligence that the Lusitania was not just carrying passengers, it was carrying munitions. And so what Great Britain was doing was using their passenger ships as basically cover for moving military goods from the U.S. to Great Britain. And so the Lusitania then, although it is a ocean liner, does it turn into a merchant ship? Should Britain be blamed for what happens to the passengers in Lusitania because they put those on there, or really is it still Germany's responsibility to not shoot at passenger liners, even though that passenger liner is somewhat of a merchant ship at this point? So May 7th, 1915, the Lusitania is sunk. 120 some lives are lost, American lives are lost, and so this is the first time where Wilson's whole idea of strict accountability is challenged, and so therefore he has to look at or respond pretty strongly to Germany, and he does. He responds with what's called the Lusitania Notes. And so the Lusitania Notes are 3 strongly worded notes, and so as you probably found out in your reading, this is where William Jennings Bryan resigns, because he feels like Wilson is pushing them towards war. So basically what happens at the end of this is Germany sends out a secret order to all their passenger ships and say, June 6th, we are, starting June 6th, we are no longer going to sink passenger liners. British or French or U.S., no passenger liners, period. So then, the sinking of the Arabic. The Arabic was a U.S. merchant ship. Several lives were lost. And basically, it was mistakenly shot. The ambassador, the German ambassador to the United States, went into Wilson, apologized right away, and promised that they would shoot at no more, that they would stop unrestricted, they wouldn't shoot at any ocean liners, anybody with U.S. merchant ships. And so they basically said, hey, we won't shoot at ocean liners anymore, we won't shoot at passenger ships. And so that seemed to, but the German ambassador did this without really consulting his government. And so what you can see is that the German government doesn't really have an idea of exactly what it wants to do with its submarines and what its policy is. And part of that is, again, because it's new technology. So this is not something that they saw or had planned out. So that brings us to the sinking of the Sussex, and this is the key one. 1916. It is a French ferry. So it goes from England to France back and forth, and it was carrying passengers, carrying 56 Americans, and it was sunk because its profile is exactly the same as a minesweeper, which is a military naval ship. And so basically what happened here is that the Sussex, the sinking of the Sussex pushed Wilson to his breaking point, and he basically responds with the Sussex ultimatum, which to Germany, and he says this: if you don't stop unrestricted submarine warfare, we will break off diplomatic relations, which basically is saying we are going to take our first steps towards war, and we will continue to go towards war with you. Now, in 1916, Germany is still fighting Russia on one front, and France and Great Britain on the other, and Great Britain's colonies, so Canada's involved in this. And so they basically are like, we can't take America right now. We don't want them to get involved. And so they basically stop unrestricted submarine warfare, and they pledge to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. But there's a catch to stopping unrestricted submarine warfare. As part of the pledge, they said you also need to get Great Britain to lift their blockade. Wilson was having problems with Great Britain, but in no cases does he tell them that they have to lift their blockade, because he considers that more of a moral action, because it is a surface blockade and they are not shooting at ships. Totally negating the Germans' technological advantage and not understanding the way submarines work. So what we have here now is the third phase, and that is the key point. Now almost every single one of these terms or events is something that you really need to know in order to make this argument, or even the argument of American honor. And so these are things on this thing that you will want to study and make sure you know. The Pless-Castle Conference is the key, though. January 1917. This conference is where Germany decides that they are going to bring Britain to its knees. Germany has just released Vladimir Lenin and some other communists into Russia, hoping that they will then win out, take control, and remove Russia from the war. And so that's kind of where Russia is heading at this point. And so then they know they can swing all their troops back to the Western Front and go after France and Great Britain and try and win the war in 1918, 1919 with a massive offensive. And so they're heading in that direction. And so they decide that they need to bring Britain to its knees. No longer can Britain be bringing in all these goods from the United States, bringing in all these goods and being able to just totally resupply themselves. And so they decide no more. And so that's where the Ples Castle Conference basically is. We are going to continue unrestricted submarine warfare. They announce it later, and they are going to sink everything. They did say, though, that the U.S. can have one ship a week. I'm not sure whose idea that was or why people thought that was a good idea. I wonder if it's kind of German sense of humor, a joke. But anyway, so we see the first one, this February 1917, sinking of the USS Housatonic. Then February 1917, the sinking of the Laconia, which was a British ship, but 2 Americans. And then between March 12th and March 16th, 1917, 4 U.S. ships were sunk without warning. And that is that last phase, the 1917 submarine campaign, which most people would agree that forced the U.S. into war. The question is, did they force the U.S. into war because of all the other circumstances that were going on, or was it really because of what the U.S. was doing? And that's a question that we're going to have to answer as we continue on here. All right, so what I want you to do now is to pull out that document of strict accountability again. I want you to reread it. How does Wilson define strict accountability? How does it try to say that the U.S., how does he try to say that the U.S. is applying this doctrine to both sides? What exactly does, when you look at this document, what exactly is strict accountability? Pull a quote out of there that really identifies what this document is saying. And then, once you've done that, go ahead and continue on with the PowerPoint, because we're going to move on and look at, okay, how much does American honor this idea that Wilson wanted to make sure that that Germany was held accountable, and that the U.S. was able to continue to travel on foreign ships, continue to do whatever it would like, and that Germany should not be sinking its ships. So I want you to take a look at that document again. You're going to come up with one quote that summarizes kind of the main idea behind it, and then we'll talk about its influence in the next slide. All right. So the difference between looking at the submarine warfare as Germany pushing the U.S. into war versus the United States and the way Wilson interpreted it is quite a bit different. So, but it's the same evidence. There's only a few new pieces of evidence and other things to go ahead and highlight. All the things that are highlighted, that need to be highlighted for this, are the ones that are circled. So you still have the war zones, which bring about the strict accountability letter. Now, the strict accountability letter, which you have just reread, is the key point to this. By Wilson saying that Germany would be strictly held accountable, he is now saying that every time you sink a ship, every time an American dies or is injured, I will act. And that really backs himself into a corner. Because at this point, what can Wilson do? Wilson can't back down. He can't ignore certain issues. If something was a mistake, he can't just go ahead and let it be a mistake. He now has to deal with every time a ship is sunk that has an American on it. And this basically puts the power in Germany, because once Germany switches to the Ples Castle Conference, that means Wilson has to go to war because of his strict accountability pledge. He can't negotiate with them. He can't talk with them. He can't work something out within the Ples Castle Conference. He just has to go ahead and go to war with them. The Lusitania notes, and part of this is the reason so many American ships after the Ples Castle Conference go down is because Wilson will not curb the amount of ships going to Great Britain. So instead of saying we are no longer going to ship to Great Britain, we'll ship to other places, we'll ship stuff up to Canada and they can ship over. No, the U.S., even though they're not at war, continues to put their ships in that war zone. Because of strict accountability, they're saying our rights will not be impeded by the German submarines, and we will continue to send ships into that area. Another new piece of evidence to take a look at is the Wilson and McLemore resolutions, February 24th, 1916. Both of these resolutions, one in the House, one in the Senate, were to say that U.S., basically saying, Congress saying the U.S. citizenships should not, and then with the McLemore, and will not, cannot, board foreign ships. So both these resolutions are basically telling the citizens of the United States that you may not get on board British, French, and other belligerent people's ships and sail into the war zone. The really interesting fact here is that Wilson goes against both of those resolutions and gets them both tabled, meaning that instead of them passing these resolutions get tabled and denied because of Wilson working behind the scenes. And what is puzzling here is why Wilson would do this. And that leads us to believe that Wilson believed that American citizens should not have to curtail where they travel, when they travel, and what they're doing in order to pacify the Germans, in order to avoid the German submarine warfare. And so instead of going along with the Gore and McLemore resolutions, instead of saying U.S. ships should not go into the war zone, and instead of saying that you should let the British bring the goods over, Wilson basically, with strict accountability, commits the Americans to putting themselves in harm's way as a way of saying that we will not cave in to the Germans. And by doing this, once the Germans decide on the Plus-Castle Conference, the U.S. has to go to war. And so the Plus-Castle Conference, then, is the key linchpin between these two reasons. Did Germany's decision in 1917 at the Plus-Castle Conference to go ahead with unrestricted submarine warfare, commit the U.S. to war, whether Wilson had said strict accountability or not, is the question. Your answer to that question depends on which of these two reasons you would rank higher. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the other three reasons. Each of them has a little bit less evidence, but obviously these are the things that you need to know in order to be able to make this.